All right. Dan, I'm going to kick it off with you. Zillow has something called Cloud HQ. What does that mean, and what made you take the leap?
Yeah. First, thanks for having us here to share our Cloud HQ story. We're really excited and proud of it. For us, Cloud HQ is about enabling our employees to work where they work best, whether that's at home, in the office, or in the office sometimes. Now, we call it Cloud HQ because we wanted to take the politics of proximity out of the equation and start from a place that remote work isn't a perk, it's a business strategy. And so for us at Zillow, it's an intentional strategy of everything we do starts in the cloud. It's going to be documented, it's going to be written down, it's going to be clear for our employees to follow. So whether they're working at home or in the office together, that they know the rules of the road. And for us, it's been really transformative on our culture.
Yeah, so you've had some notable results. I'm going to go through them. 4 times the number of job applicants. 84% of employees say that they can be themselves at work. And there's been a 5% increase in women employees. What was your secret sauce to making this work?
Well, we started from listening to what our employees wanted. And what they clearly wanted coming out of the pandemic was a workplace that wasn't going to change the rules on them, and a workplace that understood that we all learned different ways of collaborating, different ways of working. And so we started down, how do we figure out what the future of work is going to look like? And applying those learnings to building a really intentional strategy around how do you enable remote work that doesn't feel remote, that allows for in-person connection, allows for teams coming together. And those results that you just listed really speak for themselves. We're 5 years into this project. We've made a ton of mistakes, but we learn from them. And the best part, we're building this in partnership with our employees. So they're really motivated to come to the office when we ask them to come to the office versus feeling like we're forcing them there.
All right, we're going to get back to those details.
Great.
But Brooke, I'd like to ask you. So McKinsey released a bombshell study earlier this year, and it found that across remote, hybrid, in-person, the levels of burnout, intent to quit, effort, and satisfaction were all pretty similar. So do work arrangements matter at all?
Yeah, first of all, I've never heard of a McKinsey report called a bombshell report, so thank you for that. Yes, it was a surprising result, though, to your point. We did find that irrespective of the model, we looked at hybrid, remote, in-person, we found that burnout levels, exactly as you say, intent to quit, were all similar. And so it begged a question, right? Well, what's happening here? And if you look at, and this is what we did, we looked at 5 practices that we know are critical to workplace culture and health. And those are collaboration and connectivity, right, as one kind of category, innovation, and then you have mentorship and skill development. And what we found is that employee perceptions of all 5 practices were extremely low. And most interestingly, leaders' perceptions of those practices were orders of magnitude higher, which got us thinking, maybe the what question, what policy should we have, is perhaps not the wrong question, but not a sufficient question. The more important question, the more nuanced question is, how do you implement any kind of workplace policy?
Right, and so we see study after study say that workers really love remote options. They really, really love it. So how do you square what we know to be true with the results from that study?
Yeah, well, I think, it's interesting, and I've seen the same studies that talk about the preference that a lot of workers have for remote work or hybrid work. Those same studies, though, typically elucidate a number of other key factors that drive employees to stay or go. And those would be things like compensation. It matters, right? People like to get paid something that they think is a fair wage. Meaning and work, especially that connection with the manager, right? Do I feel valued by my team and my manager? And development. So I would encourage us to take a more nuanced, a more differentiated approach to thinking about this. And by the way, and Dan and I were talking about this earlier, flexibility can manifest in many different ways. I work with a lot of manufacturing companies, a lot of retail organizations that are building flexibility into in-person work, right? And we've seen the kind of the Uberization of different shift models. There's been some great innovation on that front, in particular to support working parents.
Right, and we're going to get back to that cohort in particular. All right, Dan, we've heard about the big upsides to Cloud HQ. What were some of the specific challenges you ran into, lessons learned along the way, stuff you wish you had known on day one?
Yeah, absolutely. For us, the thing that we knew we had to figure out right from the start was the intentional time together for teams. And so from the beginning, one of the biggest challenges was how do you organize bringing thousands of people together across the year? And we had a lot of learnings as we went through that process. And what has resulted is we now have a really interesting team that sits at the intersections of a lot of bodies of work, but really focuses on that schedule of bringing most of the company together on a fairly regular basis for that in-person collaboration. So whether that's scheduling, planning the meetings, planning the food, planning the activities, things that take a lot of time, centralizing those activities, but then actually publishing, we call it the cruise calendar, of when every group across the company is coming together, where they're coming together, what the purposes are of those groups coming together, and then making that transparent to the company really gives our employees the ability to understand kind of what's happening outside of the virtual world that they work in on a daily basis.
So is this like a big party, like 4 times a year?
No, it's not, but fun in person is a key goal for a lot of our Z retreats. Employees want to feel connected. Like Brooke said, feeling connection to your manager, making sure that we're bringing people together for intentional training time has been a key part of this strategy. But no, sadly, it's not about parties. But what I will say is data, as you might imagine, is quite important to us at Zillow. We've now used 5 years of data to really dial in for which types of jobs do people need to collaborate more in person. And so we set the expectation when we're hiring people, even though you may be remote and can work anywhere in the US, hey, you're gonna travel to one of our core offices 6 times a year, and we need you to be comfortable with that. And then there's other jobs that may get together only once a year. And then frankly, there are jobs where you may work your entire time at Zillow and only get together a handful of times. So we're trying to use a data-oriented approach, which really helps our employees understand when they're coming together and why they're coming together.
Okay, yeah, and I want to talk about optimizing different styles of work. So in-person, hybrid, remote, should these look different? How should they look different?
Yeah, I think they should look different. And one of the things that we've also been working with a lot of companies on is to acknowledge that setting a policy is not a strategy. Policy does not equal strategy, right? So setting a policy, the next step is creating a framework, right? Creating a set of guardrails, right, around how you want to implement that policy. And that could be in person, it could be hybrid, it could be remote. And I think that's really important because we actually put a great deal of responsibility, and I would say in some cases pressure, on some of our middle managers to interpret a broad policy at scale. That's very difficult to do. And to the question, if you're looking at collaboration, virtually versus in person, yeah, that's going to look really different. And it's not all easy in person either, right? It's not, all parties and, at companies that are trying to prioritize in-person work. In fact, many employees have come back to an office, and I'm sure some of you have experienced this, and been like, this is terrible. Like, I'm just walking the halls of people on their different Zoom calls, right? Well, that is not fostering any kind of connectivity or collaboration. So from everything from real estate to how to structure work time and versus time for collaboration, which by the way is work too, all of these things need to be thought through, and then there needs to be a process by which you upskill managers to really embrace and role model those practices. But that's not necessarily a skill set that managers had, even 5-6 years ago.
Right, okay. We're going to do best case, worst case. So Dan, remote work. Best case.
Best case, I think you're going to see a lot more companies adopting a cloud HQ model because employees are going to demand it over time.
But what do the specifics of that best case look like? Schedule the Z retreats throughout the year, how many, any kind of special other tools?
Oh, best case, I mean, you have to rethink everything around your employment policies. You have to rethink everything around the employee life cycle, how you're onboarding your employees, how you're training managers to support remote employees that come together infrequently, and then how they're actually managing through the reality of a workforce that may be trained to do everything in person in the office and in maybe traditionally inefficient ways, into a culture where you got to write everything down, to a culture where you have to be really clear and articulate in your written thoughts as much as you are in your verbal thoughts. And then planning, of course, when groups are coming together and what you're going to accomplish when you're in person collaborating.
Worst case remote.
Worst case remote is people who are looking at it as a way to optimize solely for their personal situation, aren't committed to the organization, and are not willing to adapt their style to the working norms of the team or the broader organization.
Okay, Brooke, in person, best case.
Well, I think I would start with a story, right? So how are you creating value for an in-person kind of environment, and how does that enable you to drive whatever performance outcomes you have? That tactically means the CEO, the top leaders down into the organization know that change story and know why we are choosing, in this case, the in-person working model versus not, right? So that's the starting point. Second, I think you need to get smart about how you're actually upskilling, right? Talked about the managers, but that goes all the way down to the front line, if you will, in a in-person working context. So that's equipping them with things like, meeting rituals, right? How do you start a meeting? How do you end a meeting? What are some of the common practices and norms? By the way, a lot of these would be similar practices to virtual, but they would look and feel different. In an in-person office, obviously you're going to have a different kind of meeting versus virtual. Then I would think about things like data and analytics, right? You're looking at who's coming in. Are you leaving people out, right, that can't come in? What's happening there? Are you monitoring your high performers, right? What's the impact? It doesn't mean that you should change your policy, but you might be curious about some of the impacts, right, as you fine-tune and approach that. So those would be some of the things I'd look at. Then I mentioned real estate. I do think there are real ways, and we heard an earlier presentation in which people are evolving their workspace to really live into some of the practices that we've been talking about, collaboration, innovation, et cetera.
Okay. Some groups really value flexible work more than others. Caregivers, working parents, it's really important to them. For companies thinking about what to do they have to sacrifice that group of people if they want to do in person?
Look, I think it is hard to say that all caregivers are, have one preference versus another. I think there are certainly groups of people that are prioritizing flexibility, that is for sure. But as I said earlier, there are different ways to solve for flexibility. And one thing I would say about this RTO debate is that a lot of it really is about power, right? And when can you do your work, and how does that fit in with your broader life goals, right? We went through a period during the pandemic where I think we really were, whether you were at home in your office. I was at home in my office with my kids pressed with their faces against the glass door. We all re-examined why we are doing work and what trade-offs we're making. And so I don't think you can unsee that. And so as you think about crafting a policy, I think you need to acknowledge that, but also help people who need more flexibility also get in the flow on things like development, right? One of the pieces of research we did a couple years ago coming out of the pandemic that really stuck with me was around this notion of social capital. And guess what? Women have less social capital, meaning fewer connections, fewer relationships, fewer diverse connections than men. Frontline workers have fewer or lower levels of social capital compared to senior leaders. Well, we gotta work to level that playing field. And so I think we need to acknowledge some of these needs, but also help people get to where they want to go in terms of their careers and development.
I'm wondering, for a company deciding what kind of work model they want to go with, what are some foundational questions they need to ask themselves at the beginning to make the right choice? Dan, let's start with you.
I think one, how willing are you to listen to your employees and act on what your employees tell you? Secondly, how willing you are to disrupt the ways that you work today. If you're a culture that only values face-to-face interaction and believes that's the only way that you can share and extract value from the relationship, then it's going to be a challenge if your employees feel that they would be better served in driving innovation going in a different direction. So you have to really be willing to take not the essence of what's important to you as a culture down to the studs, but the way that culture shows up on a daily basis for your employees. Listening to them, letting them architect it along with you, of course with high expectations about performance and productivity. That can't go to the wayside, but your employees will really help to architect it if you give them the opportunity.
We hear from a lot of CHROs, and they are the ones who give these mandates, even if they disagree with them. So I think a lot of people in those positions are wondering, how do I make the case? How do I show this to my CEO? What's the magic word? What advice do you have for them to make the best case they can to the powers that be?
Well, I completely agree. I work with a lot of CHROs that are like, if I get one more forwarded email about RTO from my CEO, right, I'm literally gonna just die. So I think it's a thing. I guess where I would start from is, going back to what Dan said, let's actually put aside my own feelings and think about what does this business need to deliver value, right? I work at a large aerospace and defense company. Well, they manufacture big things. They need to be in person, and they wanted to make sure that there was parity, right, between the in-person workers and those that were sitting in the corporate office. Great. So they have a clear thesis, and they're going to go implement that. I work with a large quick service restaurant, right? They also have a huge emphasis placed on in-person work, but they ultimately ended up with a hybrid model and wanted to cultivate development in that way. So I think you really got to figure out, I like the down to the studs, what are going to be the critical ways in which your people need to work to deliver that value. And by the way, employee experience is part of that formula for value. Let's not forget that, right? And so that's where I would have the discussion with my fellow executives if I were making a case, and then discern the policy and ultimately the strategy based on that discussion.
All right, Dan, Brooke, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.